The air was a sterile whisper, filtered and chilled to a precise 17 degrees Celsius. It tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing, and carried no sound but the faint, rhythmic hum of the life support systems embedded in the walls. For Elian, this absence was a presence. It was the texture of his existence, a smooth, cold void pressed against his skin. He sat on the edge of the cot, the fabric a synthetic blend that never held warmth, his bare feet resting on the polished chrome steel floor. The light in the cell was uniform, a sourceless, shadowless luminescence that bleached the world of depth and nuance. It was the light of observation, not of living. He was an organism in a petri dish, and the light was the microscope's glare. He traced the seam on his simple grey tunic, a single line of stitching that ran from collar to hem. It was a perfect, unbroken line. Everything in this place was perfect, unbroken, except for him. He was designation 734, an omega of rare psychic resonance, an asset of immeasurable value to the Enclave. He was also a fracture in their perfect system, a variable they could calibrate but never truly control. They had told him what he was 1,000 times, the words spoken in calm, measured tones that stripped them of meaning and left only the cold, hard weight of definition. He was an asset. He was a tool. He was a biological instrument whose purpose was to feel the subtle psychic frequencies that others could not, to act as a living antenna for the whispers that moved between the stars. His sensitivity was his function, his designation, his identity. But in the silent, empty spaces between the tests and the conditioning, he was just Elian, and he felt like nothing at all. He felt like a ghost haunting the sterile shell of a body that did not belong to him. The door hissed open, the sound a clean, sharp tear in the fabric of the silence. Elian didn't look up. He knew the precise cadence of the footsteps, the weight of the presence that filled the void. It was Alpha Kale, his designated handler, the architect of his gilded cage. Kale was like the room, perfect, controlled, and cold. He moved with an economy of motion that was both elegant and unnerving, his black uniform absorbing the flat light, making him a pillar of shadow in the white, bright cell. The only thing about him that was not contained was his scent. It was a subtle, complex fragrance of ozone after a storm, of cold stone and something wilder, deeper, like the scent of pine needles crushed underfoot in a forest Elian had only ever seen in simulations. The scent was a violation of the sterile air, a constant reminder of the raw biological reality that the Enclave tried so hard to suppress. It filled Elian's senses, a pressure he could feel even with his eyes closed. Designation 734, Kale's voice was low, a resonant baritone that held no inflection. It was the voice of command, of protocol. Prepare for calibration. Elian rose slowly, his movements fluid, practiced. He was a dancer in a play he had not written, his every step choreographed by years of conditioning. He turned to face Kale. Kale's face was a mask of placid control, his features sharp and symmetrical, his eyes the color of a winter sky. They held no warmth, only a focused, analytical intelligence. He held a small silver device in his gloved hand, the calibrator. It would measure Elian's baseline psychic emissions, ensuring he was stable, functional, a tool being tuned before use. Elian stood before him, head bowed slightly, in the prescribed posture of submission. He was not a person. He was a designation. He was not a man. He was an Omega. These were the facts of his world. Kyle raised the device, its cool metal surface hovering inches from Elian's temple. Elian could feel the subtle energy field it generated, a low thrum against his psychic senses. He closed his eyes, letting the sensation wash over him. It was familiar, unpleasant, like the probing of a cold, sterile instrument into the softest parts of his mind. He focused on his breathing, on the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, a small organic anchor in the sea of synthetic perfection. He could feel Kale's proximity, a palpable weight in the air. He could feel the quiet hum of Kale's own powerful biology, the tightly leashed energy of an alpha conditioned to absolute control. It was a dangerous, fascinating counterpoint to the sterile hum of the technology around them. "Baseline is stable," Kale stated, lowering the device. His gaze lingered on Elian's face for a fraction of a second longer than protocol required. It was a flicker, a momentary deviation in the perfect machine, but Elian felt it like a physical touch. In that brief moment, the analytical gaze was replaced by something else, something deeper and more complex. It was not kindness, it was not cruelty, it was a kind of focused intensity, a recognition that went beyond the clinical assessment of an asset. Then it was gone, the mask of control snapping back into place. "The director's audit is scheduled for this cycle. Your performance must be optimal." Elian inclined his head. "I understand." His own voice sounded thin and reedy in the silent room, the voice of a stranger. He did understand. He understood that his value was tied directly to his performance. He understood that failure was not an option. The Enclave did not tolerate faulty equipment. He was a finely tuned instrument, and he would play his part. But as Kyle turned to leave, his scent lingering in the air like a fading echo, a single defiant thought bloomed in the sterile silence of Elian's mind. He was not an instrument. He was not a designation. He was Elian, and he was suffocating. The thought was a whisper, a tiny crack in the perfect, polished surface of his conditioning. It was a dangerous thought, the kind that could get a man dismantled, but it was his. It was the only thing in this entire sterile world that truly belonged to him. The director's audit was not, in fact, conducted by the director. It was conducted by his heir, his progeny, a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, all sharp angles and abrasive confidence. His name was Rorik, and he was Kyle's older brother. Where Kyle was a blade of honed, polished steel, Rorik was a bludgeon of raw iron. He entered the cell with 2 adjutants in tow, his presence a discordant noise that shattered the room's oppressive quiet. His scent was a sour, aggressive version of Kale's. The ozone note curdled, the pine scent acrid like burning wood. It clawed at Elian's senses, setting his teeth on edge. Kyle stood a few paces behind him, a silent shadow, his face as impassive as ever. But Elian, who had learned to read the subtle shifts in Kyle's stillness, could feel the tension radiating from him. It was the tight, coiled energy of a predator forced to heal. Rorik circled Elian, his eyes sweeping over him with a look of proprietary assessment, like a farmer inspecting livestock. "So this is it," he said, his voice a low sneer. "The Enclave's prized empath, the key to the outer sectors." He stopped in front of Elian, close enough that Elian could see the faint sheen of sweat on his upper lip. "Doesn't look like much, fragile." He reached out, his ungloved fingers brushing against the sleeve of Elian's tunic. The touch was casual, contemptuous, and it sent a jolt of revulsion through Elian. He flinched, a small, involuntary movement that did not go unnoticed. Rorik's lips twisted into a cruel smile. Skittish too. You've been keeping it too isolated, little brother. It needs a firmer hand. Kyle's voice was ice. The asset's conditioning is optimized for sensitivity. Physical contact is restricted under Protocol 7 Gamma. Protocols, Rorik scoffed, not taking his eyes off Elian. He took another step closer, invading Elian's personal space, his scent a suffocating cloud. Protocols are for lesser men who need rules to guide them. I am guided by results. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud in the silent room. Tell me, little Omega, what do you feel from me? Do you feel my power, my ambition? Or do you just feel how much I want to see what happens when something as delicate as you breaks? Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his body rigid. He would not give this man the satisfaction of a reaction. He would be the perfect instrument, unresponsive until commanded. He could feel the psychic static rolling off Rorik in waves, a chaotic mess of arrogance, cruelty, and a deep-seated insecurity that festered beneath the surface. It was ugly, and it made him feel sick. He does not speak unless spoken to by his designated handler, Kyle said. The words were flat, a simple statement of fact, but there was a new edge to them, a sharpness that cut through the sterile air. Rorik finally turned to face his brother, a mocking smirk on his face. My, so protective. Has the little pet wormed its way into your cold, mechanical heart? He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He then turned back to Elian, his expression hardening. It's just an Omega, a genetic fluke we've managed to turn into a tool. Useful, yes, but ultimately disposable, like a sensitive piece of lab equipment. You calibrate it, you use it, and when it breaks, you discard it. He looked at Elian with utter disdain. Omega or not, you're nothing special. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. They were not new to Elian. He had heard variations of them his entire life. He had even internalized them. He was nothing special. He was a tool. But hearing them from this man, spoken with such casual, venomous cruelty, felt different. It felt like a physical blow. He braced himself for the psychic backlash of Rorik's contempt. But the backlash never came from Rorik. It came from Kyle. There was no sound, no warning. One moment, Kyle was a statue of controlled stillness. The next, he moved. It was a blur of motion, a fluid, economical strike that was terrifying in its precision. His hand shot out, not in a punch, but with his fingers extended, rigid as steel. The strike connected with Rorik's throat. There was a sickening, wet crunch, a sound that was obscene in the sterile room. Rorik's eyes went wide, his sneer frozen on his face in a mask of shock and disbelief. A gurgling sound escaped his lips as he clawed at his neck, his body convulsing. He stumbled backward, crashing into the two adjutants, who stood frozen in horror. Then he collapsed, a puppet with its strings cut. He did not move again. Silence. A profound, absolute silence descended, heavier and more complete than any that had come before. It was the silence of a vacuum, the silence of a world that had just ended. The two adjutants stared, their faces slack with terror, their eyes locked on the body of the director's heir lying crumpled on the chrome steel floor. Elian stared, his mind a white-hot blank. He couldn't process what he had just seen. The sheer, unadulterated violence of it was anathema to this place. It was a chaotic, organic, bloody intrusion into a world of perfect, sterile order. And then Kale spoke. His voice was perfectly calm, perfectly level, as if he were reading a routine report, but it was directed at Elian. His winter sky eyes met Elian's, and for the first time, Elian saw not a handler, not a machine, but a man who had just committed an unthinkable act. "He was wrong," Kale said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to fill the entire universe. "You are not nothing." The world tilted on its axis. The sterile white room, the dead man on the floor, the terrified guards, it all receded into a blur. The only thing that was real was Kale's gaze, the impossible weight of his words, and the lingering, acrid scent of death that now clung to the perfect, sterile air. The system had just broken. And in its place, something new and terrifying and utterly unknown was beginning. The silence in the cell was a living thing now, thick with the coppery tang of blood and the ozone of discharged weaponry. The two adjutants remained frozen, their training and their terror warring for control of their bodies. They were cogs in a machine that had just witnessed its own master gear shatter. Their eyes darted from Rorik's still form to Kale, who stood with an unnerving placidity, as if he had merely corrected a minor data error. He hadn't even broken a sweat. His black uniform was immaculate, his posture unchanged. Only the slightest tension in his jaw betrayed the cataclysm that had just occurred. Elian's own body was a traitor. A tremor started in his hands, a fine, uncontrollable vibration that threatened to shake him apart. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one a painful scrape against his throat. He was seeing the world through a distorted lens, the shadowless light of the cell seeming to pulse and warp. He had witnessed violence before, in training simulations, in historical records, but it was always distant, sanitized, an abstraction of data points and strategic outcomes. This was not an abstraction. This was the visceral reality of a life extinguished, the final messy severance of a soul from its vessel. The crunch of bone, the gurgle of a dying breath, these were sounds that would be etched into his memory forever. Kyle moved again, his actions as precise and deliberate as the strike that had killed his brother. He turned to the adjutants, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the pure, unadulterated tone of command that no one in the Enclave was conditioned to disobey. "Emergency Protocol 0. This is now a compromised sector. You saw nothing. You heard nothing. A synaptic purge will be administered to you both within the hour. Until then, you will secure the corridor and await my signal. Acknowledge." The taller of the two adjutants finally broke his paralysis, his head jerking in a convulsive nod. "Acknowledged, Commander," he stammered, his voice thin and cracking. The other followed suit, his face pale as bleached bone. They moved stiffly, like automatons whose programming had been corrupted, backing out of the cell and sealing the door behind them. Their disciplined retreat was a testament to the depth of Kale's authority, an authority he had just used to conceal an act of high treason. Now, they were alone, just Elian, Kale, and the body. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a shared silence, a conspiratorial one. Kale turned his gaze back to Elian, and the impassive mask was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, a maelstrom of emotions that Elian could feel washing over him in waves. It was not just the psychic resonance of a powerful alpha. It was the unfiltered broadcast of a man whose entire world had been upended by his own hand. There was guilt, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. There was a terrifying, possessive fury that still simmered beneath the surface, and underneath it all, there was a profound, aching confusion. "He should not have touched you," Kale said, the words spoken so softly they were almost a thought. He took a step toward Elian, and Elian flinched back, his body reacting before his mind could. He pressed himself against the cold wall of the cell, the chrome steel a stark, unyielding reality against his back. Kyle stopped, a flicker of something that might have been pain crossing his features. "I will not harm you." The statement was absurd. Elian had just watched him kill a man, his own brother, with the casual efficiency of swatting an insect. The capacity for harm was not in question, but as Elian looked into Kale's eyes, he understood. The violence had not been directed at him. It had been, in some twisted, incomprehensible way, for him. The thought was so staggering, so contrary to the fundamental principles of his existence, that he couldn't fully grasp it. He was an asset, a tool. One did not kill for a tool. One did not commit treason for a piece of equipment. Kale began the cleanup. He moved with a chilling, methodical grace, as if he were following a pre-written protocol for disposing of a high-ranking official. He activated a silent incinerator panel in the floor, the chrome steel retracting to reveal a humming, heat-hazed void. He stripped Rorik of his rank insignia and data slate, his movements efficient and impersonal. He did not look at his brother's face. He treated the body as he would any other piece of problematic evidence, an object to be removed from the equation. He rolled the corpse into the incinerator with a detached strength, and the panel slid shut. There was no smoke, no smell, just a faint shimmer of heat in the air. And then, nothing. Rorik was gone, erased. Kyle then retrieved a small metallic case from a hidden compartment in the wall. From it, he took a hypo spray and a vial of clear liquid. "The adjutants will be given a full synaptic purge," he explained, his voice returning to its familiar clinical tone, as if the proximity to routine could somehow restore the broken order. "Their memories of the last hour will be wiped clean. The official record will state that Director Rorik completed his audit and departed for the outer sectors. He will become lost in transit, a tragic, unavoidable accident." He was constructing a new reality, brick by meticulous brick over the smoking crater of the old one. He then turned to Elian, the hypospray in his hand. "You, however, are a different problem. Your memory cannot be wiped without damaging your resonance capabilities." He paused, his gaze intense. "You are the only witness, the only one who knows the truth." Elian's blood ran cold. He was a loose end, a liability. The logic of the Enclave was simple and brutal. Liabilities were neutralized. His life, which had always been conditional, was now hanging by the most slender of threads. He pressed himself further into the wall, a primal fear seizing him. But Kyle didn't move closer. He simply stood there, watching him, the hypo spray held loosely in his hand. "They will come for you," Kyle said, his voice low and urgent. "When Rorik doesn't report in, they will investigate. They will analyze every log, every sensor reading, and they will come here. They will dissect your mind piece by piece to find out what you know." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I cannot let that happen." Elian closed his eyes, bracing for the sting of the needle, for the cold oblivion that would follow. This was the end, the logical conclusion. He was a faulty instrument, a witness to a crime that could topple the Enclave's leadership. He was too dangerous to be left alive. But the needle never came. Instead, he felt a warmth envelop his hand. He opened his eyes, in shock. Kyle was kneeling before him, his head bowed. He had taken Elian's trembling hand in his own gloved one. The contact was electric, a stark contrast to Rorik's vile touch. This was not a touch of ownership or contempt. It was something else entirely. It was a plea, a promise. "I am moving you," Kyle said, his voice a raw whisper. He finally looked up, and the control in his eyes had shattered completely, replaced by a fierce, desperate vulnerability that stole Elian's breath. "To my quarters. It is the only place shielded from deep-level surveillance. The only place I can keep you safe. Safe." The word was alien to Elian. He had been contained, monitored, managed, but never safe. Safety implied a value beyond utility, a personal stake in his well-being that no one had ever shown him. Kyle's grip on his hand tightened, a silent, emphatic punctuation to his words. The man who had been the very embodiment of the system that imprisoned him had just become his sole protector. The man who had told him he was nothing special had just sacrificed everything to deny those words. The irony was a bitter, dizzying pill. "You will come with me," Kyle said. It was not a question. It was not a command. It was a statement of a new, undeniable reality. "From this moment on, you do not leave my side." Elian looked down at their joined hands, the black synthetic glove against his pale skin, the alpha and the omega, the commander and the asset. But the roles had fractured, the definitions blurred. He was no longer just designation 734. He was a witness, a secret, a reason for treason. And as Kale led him out of the sterile white cell, away from the faint shimmer of heat where a man had ceased to exist, Elian knew that his life as a tool was over. His life as something else, something terrifyingly unknown, had just begun. He was being led from one cage into another, but for the first time he felt the fragile, terrifying spark of something that might one day be called hope. The transition from the stark, impersonal cell to Kale's private quarters was a journey across a psychological chasm. Kale's quarters were a world away from the sterile white aesthetic that dominated the enclave. They were a pocket of shadow and substance in a universe of flat, sterile light. The walls were not the ubiquitous chrome steel, but a dark, slate-gray composite that seemed to drink the light from the recessed fixtures, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. There was a sense of lived-in history here, a stark contrast to Elian's memoryless existence. A large viewport, currently polarized to an opaque black, dominated one wall. A desk of dark, polished wood was covered in data slates and star charts, arranged with a precision that bordered on obsessive. And there was a bed, larger than Elian's simple cot, covered in a dark, heavy textile. The most overwhelming change, however, was the scent. In the cell, Kale's scent had been an intrusion, a foreign element in the sterile air. Here, it was the air itself. It permeated everything: the fabric of the chairs, the cool metal of the desk, the very stillness of the room. The scent of ozone, cold stone, and pine was no longer just a fragrance. It was the fundamental atmosphere of this new reality. It wrapped around Elian, a thick, invisible blanket that was both suffocating and strangely grounding. He stood in the center of the room, feeling small and exposed, a foreign organism introduced into a sealed ecosystem. He was acutely aware of the door sliding shut behind them, the soft hiss and solid thud sealing them in, sealing them together. Kyle moved to the central console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. He was rerouting sensor data, creating a ghost loop of Elian's presence in the original cell, a digital phantom that would satisfy any low-level security sweep. He worked with a focused, silent intensity, the only sound the soft chime of the console as it accepted his commands. Elian watched him, studying the rigid line of his back, the controlled tension in his shoulders. Kale was a man building a fortress around a secret, and Elian was that secret. The realization was a heavy weight in his chest. A person's life, a person's future, now depended on his silence, on his complicity. "You will stay here," Kyle said without turning around. "Do not attempt to access the door controls. They are keyed to my bio-signature alone. Do not attempt to use the comms unit. It is monitored." He was dictating the rules of this new cage, his voice once again clipped and professional. It was a retreat into the familiar language of control, a way to manage the unmanageable chaos he had unleashed. He finished his work at the console and finally turned to face Elian. The space between them felt charged, a vacuum crackling with unspoken words and unthinkable truths. Kale's eyes, those winter sky eyes, were shadowed with exhaustion. The mask of command was slipping, revealing the immense strain beneath. He had not just killed his brother, he had severed his own connection to the world he knew, to the system he had served with unwavering devotion. He had made himself an island, and he had pulled Elian onto it with him. "Are you hungry?" The question was so mundane, so jarringly domestic, that it took Elian a moment to process it. Hunger was a biological imperative managed by the Enclave. A nutrient paste was dispensed at precise intervals. The concept of someone asking him if he was hungry was entirely foreign. Elian shook his head, though his stomach was a tight, aching knot. The thought of food was nauseating. Kyle nodded, seeming to understand. He moved to a small replicator unit in the wall and produced a bulb of water, which he held out to Elian. "Drink." Elian took it, his fingers brushing against Kale's. The contact was brief, but it sent a spark through his system. He drank the water, the cool liquid, a small comfort to his raw throat. He watched Kale over the rim of the bulb, trying to understand the man before him. Was this pity, guilt, or something else, something he didn't have a name for? Why would a man who had been his jailer now act as his caretaker? The roles were inverted, the power dynamic shattered and reforming into a strange, new shape. For days, they existed in this suspended reality. Kale would leave for long periods, attending to his duties, maintaining the fiction that everything was normal. He would return to the quarters, his face a mask of iron control. But Elian could feel the psychic fraying at his edges, the constant, grinding stress of his deception. During these times, Elian was left alone in the silent twilight room. He explored his new prison cautiously. He ran his fingers over the spines of the data slates on Kale's desk, treatises on xenobiology, tactical manuals, ancient poetry. He stood before the polarized viewport and imagined the star-dusted void that lay beyond it, a universe he was born to sense but was forbidden to see. He learned Kale through the objects he kept, a single, smooth black stone on his nightstand, a faded photograph tucked into a physical book of two young boys with the same winter sky eyes, one smiling broadly, the other staring at the camera with a solemn intensity. Rorik and Kyle. The image sent a chill through him. It was a ghost, a reminder of the life Kale had destroyed, the blood that was now, in a way, on both their hands. He felt a pang of something akin to guilt, a shared culpability in a crime he had only witnessed. Their interactions were sparse, functional. Kale would bring him food, which Elian would force himself to eat. They rarely spoke. The silence was their primary mode of communication. In the quiet, Elian became more attuned to Kale's presence than ever before. He could feel the shifts in Kale's mood without a word being spoken. He could sense the waves of anxiety that rolled off him when he returned from a high-level briefing, the bone-deep weariness that settled on him as he sat at his desk late into the night, staring at the star charts as if searching for an escape route. One night, Kale returned later than usual. The door hissed open and he stumbled in, his uniform disheveled. There was a dark bruise high on his cheekbone, and the scent of sterile medical antiseptic clung to him, a sharp counterpoint to his own scent. Elian, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed, rose to his feet. What happened? The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. It was the first time he had initiated a conversation. Kale looked at him, his expression unreadable. "An unscheduled sparring session," he said, his voice rough. "With the new head of security. He has questions about Rorik's extended absence." He walked to the small washroom, moving with a stiff, pained gait. Elian heard the splash of water. When Kale emerged, he was shirtless, dabbing at a cut on his lip with a damp cloth. Elian's eyes were drawn to the man's torso. It was a landscape of scars, old, faded white lines from blades, puckered circles from energy weapons, a large, ragged patch of discolored skin on his side from a chemical burn. It was the body of a soldier, a tool of the Enclave, marked and reshaped by a lifetime of violence. It was a testament to his own conditioning, a mirror of the psychological scars that covered Elian's own soul. Kyle was not perfect, unbroken machine. He was as damaged as Elian was, just in a different way. A sudden, overwhelming impulse seized Elian. He felt the psychic noise radiating from Kale, a chaotic symphony of pain, stress, and a deep, simmering rage. It was a psychic wound bleeding into the atmosphere of the room. Without thinking, without considering the protocol or the danger, he crossed the space between them. He reached out a hesitant hand, not to touch Kyle's skin, but to hover it just an inch above the large, ugly burn on his side. He closed his eyes and did what he was trained to do. He listened. He felt. And then he sent out a wave of his own psychic energy. Not the probing, analytical frequency the Enclave had trained him to use, but something else, a soft, gentle hum, a psychic balm. He tried to soothe the jagged edges of Kyle's pain, to quiet the storm raging inside him. He felt Kyle go rigid, his breath catching in his throat. The chaotic psychic energy stuttered, then slowly, tentatively, began to smooth out. Kyle's tense muscles relaxed slightly. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips. Elian had never used his ability this way. It had always been a tool for observation, for data collection. He had never used it to heal, to comfort. The act was intimate, a violation of every rule that had ever governed his existence. But it felt right. It felt like the first truly autonomous act of his life. He held the connection for a long moment, pouring his own quiet stillness into the turbulent sea of Kyle's mind. Finally, his strength waning, he lowered his hand and opened his eyes. Kale was staring at him, his winter sky eyes wide with a look of stunned wonder. The analytical gaze was gone. The commander was gone. In his place was a man who looked as if he had been touched for the very first time. How Kale's voice was a choked whisper. "I don't know," Elian answered honestly, his own voice trembling slightly. Kale reached out, his hand moving slowly, as if not to spook a wild animal. He gently took Elian's hand, the one that had just soothed him, and turned it over, studying his palm as if it held some profound secret. His thumb stroked the back of Elian's hand, the touch of his bare skin a shocking, searing brand against Elian's. It was a touch devoid of analysis or control. It was a touch of pure, unadulterated reverence. In that moment, the last of the old world fell away. They were no longer handler and asset, alpha and omega. They were two broken pieces of the same brutal system, finding a strange and dangerous solace in each other's orbit. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with a new, fragile, and terrifying intimacy. They stood in the twilight of the room, their hands clasped together, bound not by protocol or fear, but by a shared secret and a shared pain. The fortress Kale had built to protect his secret was becoming a sanctuary, and in the heart of that sanctuary, a new and impossible connection was taking root. The act of psychic healing, a thing Elian had not known he was capable of, became a new, unspoken language between them. It was a bridge across the chasm of their conditioning, a form of communication more profound than any words they could have exchanged. It became a ritual. When Kale returned from his duties, the weight of his deception pressing down on him like a physical force, Elian would reach for him. Not with his hands at first, but with his mind. He would sit in silence, feeling the turbulent currents of Kale's psyche, and gently send out waves of calm, smoothing the frayed edges, offering a quiet sanctuary within Kale's own mind. Kale, in turn, began to open himself to it. The man who had been the epitome of control learned to surrender, to allow Elian's quiet strength to wash over him. He would sit in one of the dark chairs, his eyes closed, his body slowly uncoiling from the rigid posture of a soldier on high alert. For those few moments, he was not Commander Kale, the traitor hiding in plain sight. He was just a man, weary and wounded, finding a respite he had never known he needed. This intimacy bled into the physical world. The careful distance they had maintained began to shrink. A shared meal was no longer a silent, functional affair. Their eyes would meet over the replicated food, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. A fleeting touch as one passed the other in the confined space became less accidental, lingering for a fraction of a second too long. One evening, Kale depolarized the viewport. For the first time, Elian saw the reality of the space beyond the enclave. It was a breathtaking, terrifying vista of infinite blackness, dusted with the cold, distant fire of 1,000 stars. A nebula bloomed in the distance, a cosmic bruise of violet and magenta against the void. Elian stood before it, transfixed. He had felt these things psychically. He had registered their frequencies as data points, as celestial whispers to be logged and analyzed. But to see them, to witness the sheer, silent majesty of it all, was overwhelming. He felt the immensity of the universe press in on him, and in its face, his own small, contained existence seemed both insignificant and unbearably tragic. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his breath fogging the transparent plasteel. Kyle came to stand beside him, his shoulder almost brushing Elian's. "It is," he agreed, his voice quiet. But he was not looking at the stars. He was looking at Elian's reflection in the viewport, at the starlight shining in his wide, captivated eyes. My mother used to say that each star was a soul that had found its freedom. It was the first time Kyle had ever mentioned his family, other than the spectre of Rorik that lay between them. The mention of his mother, of a past before the Enclave had shaped him into a weapon, was a startlingly personal revelation. "Did she serve the Enclave?" Elian asked, his curiosity overriding his caution. A shadow passed over Kyle's face. "She was a scientist, a theorist in psychic resonance. She believed that the abilities of people like you were not a tool for control, but a bridge for understanding, a way to connect with the universe, not conquer it." He paused, his gaze turning to the stars. Her ideas were deemed inefficient, counterproductive to the Enclave's mission of order and expansion. She was reassigned. It was a typical Enclave euphemism, a sterile word used to cover a multitude of sins. It could mean anything from exile to decommissioning. Elian didn't need to ask. He could feel the old deep wound in Kyle's psyche, a grief that had been walled off and buried for years. He now understood the source of the solemn intensity he'd seen in the young boy's eyes in the photograph. Kyle was not just a product of the Enclave's conditioning. He was its victim, too. His devotion had been built on a foundation of loss and a desperate need to find order in a system that had created chaos in his own life. Rorik believed in the Enclave's mission, Kale continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He believed in strength, in control. He saw our mother's theories as a weakness. He embraced the doctrine that we were to be the masters of the universe, not its students. He thought I was weak for holding on to her memory. The pieces clicked into place for Elian. Rorik's contempt for him had not just been about his Omega status. It had been an extension of his contempt for everything his mother had represented, for the sensitivity and empathy he had labeled as a weakness, and Kale's violent, protective reaction. It had not just been about the insult to Elian. It had been a defense of his mother's memory, a final, bloody rejection of his brother's brutal philosophy. He had not just killed Rorik. He had killed the part of himself that had tried to appease Rorik's worldview for his entire life. "I am sorry," Elian said softly. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Kale turned to him, his eyes filled with a profound, aching sadness. "Do not be sorry," he said. You are the proof that she was right." He reached out and gently touched Elian's cheek, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw. The touch was feather-light, yet it grounded Elian in a way nothing else ever had. It was a touch of validation, of recognition. In that moment, he was not designation 734. He was not an asset. He was Elian, and he was the living embodiment of a forgotten hope. The fragile barrier between them finally dissolved. Kyle leaned in, slowly, giving Elian every opportunity to pull away. But Elian didn't move. He stood, frozen by a mixture of fear and a longing so deep it was an ache in his bones. He leaned into the touch, closing his eyes as Kale's lips met his. The kiss was not one of passion or desperation. It was one of quiet, profound discovery. It was gentle, hesitant, a question asked in a language neither of them was fluent in. It tasted of Kyle's grief and Elian's loneliness, of shared secrets and a future that was terrifyingly uncertain. It was the sealing of a pact made in silence and blood, a final acknowledgement that their fates were now inextricably intertwined. When they finally broke apart, they simply stood in the starlight, their foreheads resting against each other, breathing the same air. The universe outside was vast and cold, but in this small, shadowed room, they had created a pocket of impossible warmth. But the sanctuary they had built was a fragile one. The system they had defied was relentless. One cycle, Kale returned with a new, dangerous tension coiling in his gut. Elian felt it the moment the door opened, a sharp, discordant note in his psychic field. "They're closing the investigation into Rorik's disappearance," Kyle said, his voice tight. "They've ruled it a probable vessel malfunction in the Tartarus Rift. The case is officially closed." A wave of relief washed over Elian, but it was short-lived. He saw the grim look on Kale's face. "That's good, isn't it?" Elian asked. Kale shook his head, running a hand through his dark hair. "No. It's too neat, too fast. The new security chief, Valerius, he signed off on it himself. Valerius was Rorik's protégé. He's ambitious, and he's not a fool. He wouldn't close a case this high-profile unless he was certain he knew the answer and was simply clearing the board for his next move." A cold dread seeped into Elian's bones. What does he want? He wants what Rorik wanted. Control, power, Kyle said, pacing the room like a caged animal. "And there's a new project being fast-tracked, Project Chimera. It involves the integration of high-resonance omegas directly into a ship's neural interface, a living navigation and targeting system. It requires a full synaptic overwrite. The omega's consciousness is subsumed. They become little more than a biological processor for the vessel." Elian felt the blood drain from his face. He would be a ghost in a machine, his mind erased, his body enslaved in the most absolute way imaginable. They would do that? "It was Rorik's pet project," Kyle said, his voice laced with venom. "And Valerius is its new champion. He's been looking for a prime candidate, and the Enclave's most valuable, most sensitive psychic asset has been offline, confined to his cell for stability reasons for weeks." He stopped pacing and looked at Elian, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "He's not closing the investigation. He's clearing a path. He's coming for you, Elian, and he's not going to ask for my permission." The illusion of safety shattered. Their small sanctuary was about to be breached. The system was not just a faceless entity, it now had a name and a face, and it was moving against them. They were out of time. The apathetic hum of the Enclave, which had been the soundtrack to their tense sanctuary, now felt like the ticking of a clock counting down to their destruction. Kale's revelation about Project Chimera was not just a threat. It was a death sentence for the person Elian was just beginning to discover. The idea of his consciousness being overwritten, his mind becoming a mere processor, was a violation more profound than any physical harm. It was the ultimate expression of the Enclave's philosophy, the complete and total subsumption of the individual for the utility of the system. He was not a person, he was a component, and he was about to be permanently installed. Kyle saw the terror in his eyes, the way the color drained from his face, and his expression hardened into one of grim resolve. The time for hiding, for biding their time, was over. The passive defense of their small fortress had failed. Now, their only option was to attack, to flee. "We leave," Kyle stated, the words cutting through the thick, fearful silence. "Tonight." The declaration was as shocking as the murder that had started it all. Leaving the Enclave was not just a matter of walking out a door. The Enclave was a self-contained world, a fortress moonlet bristling with security systems, patrol drones, and soldiers conditioned to obey without question. To leave was to declare war on the only world they had ever known. How? Elian's voice was barely a whisper. The idea was so immense, so impossible, it felt like a fantasy. I have been planning this since the day Rorik died, Kyle admitted, his voice low and intense. He moved to his desk and with a series of coded commands brought up a holographic schematic of the enclave. It was a complex, multi-layered blueprint of corridors, power conduits, and security checkpoints. I knew this day would come. I hoped it wouldn't, but I prepared for it. He had been playing a long, desperate game, maintaining his role as a loyal commander while secretly mapping out their escape. There is a service conduit on the lower levels. It leads to the decommissioned freighter docks. The security patrols there are minimal, automated. Most of the ships are little more than scrap, but one, a small courier vessel, the Stardust Drifter. I have been siphoning power and fuel to it for weeks. Its systems are old, untraceable by the new Enclave network. He was not just a soldier, he was a strategist. He had used his intimate knowledge of the system to find its cracks, its forgotten corners. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal, but it was a plan. It was a sliver of hope in the suffocating darkness. Valerius will make his move during the sector-wide diagnostic reboot 4 hours from now, Kale continued, his finger tracing a path through the holographic maze. The internal sensors will be down for exactly 97 seconds. That is our window. We have to get from here to the lower docks in that time. 97 seconds. It was an impossibly short amount of time to cross several levels of a high-security military installation. We'll never make it, Elian said, the despair evident in his voice. We will, Kyle insisted, his gaze locking with Elian's. Because they will be looking for a soldier and a prisoner. They won't be looking for 2 ghosts. He then turned to a locker in the corner of the room and pulled out 2 dark grey maintenance jumpsuits. They were nondescript, the kind of uniform that would make the wearer invisible. He also retrieved 2 small metallic objects. These are synaptic dampeners. They will mask our biosignatures from any active proximity scanners, but they will also block your ability. You will be blind, psychically. Elian looked at the dampener. To be without his resonance, the sense that had defined his entire life, was to be truly and utterly blind. He would be completely dependent on Kale, a thought that was both terrifying and, in a strange way, comforting. It was the ultimate act of trust. He nodded, his resolve hardening. He would rather be blind and free than a seeing slave. As the hour of the reboot approached, the tension in the room became a palpable force. Kale went over the plan again and again, his voice a low, steady murmur, drilling the root into Elian's memory. He showed Elian how to use a plasma cutter, how to disable a simple magnetic lock. He was no longer treating Elian as an asset to be protected, but as a partner in their rebellion. The dynamic had shifted one final time. They were equals, their survival dependent on each other. They changed into the maintenance jumpsuits, the rough fabric a stark contrast to the soft tunics Elian was used to. Kale strapped a compact pulse rifle to his own back and handed Elian a small, powerful sidearm. Elian's hand trembled as he took it. The cold, heavy weight of the weapon was an alien sensation. He had never held a weapon before. He was an instrument of perception, not of destruction. You may not need it, Kale said, his voice gentle as he helped Elian holster the weapon. But I will not let you be defenseless. Aim for the central mass, The weapon will do the rest. Finally, it was time. Kale activated the synaptic dampeners. For Elian, the world suddenly went quiet. The constant, low-level psychic hum of the enclave, the background noise he had lived with his entire life, vanished. The comforting presence of Kale's own psychic field disappeared. There was only silence, a profound, terrifying emptiness that left him feeling utterly alone and exposed. He looked at Kale, and for the first time he could read nothing from him but what he saw on his face. He had to trust the man, not the empathic feeling. "It's time," Kale said, his voice sounding distant in the new silence. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say. And do not hesitate." Kale keyed a command into his personal data slate. The lights in the room flickered and died, plunging them into a momentary darkness before the dim, red emergency lighting kicked in. The sector-wide reboot had begun. Their 97 seconds had started. Kale opened the door, and they slipped out into the empty corridor. The enclave, usually teeming with activity, was eerily still. It was a ghost station, its inhabitants frozen in place, waiting for the system to come back online. They moved quickly, their soft-soled boots making no sound on the metal floors. Kyle led the way, his movements economical and sure, a shadow flowing through other shadows. Elian followed close behind, his heart hammering in his chest, his senses on high alert. Without his psychic resonance, every flicker of light, every distant metallic clang seemed magnified, a potential threat. They descended through a service hatch, the air growing warmer, thick with the smell of ozone and hot machinery. This was the mechanical gut of the enclave, a place Elian had never known existed. They navigated a labyrinth of humming power conduits and hissing pipes, Kyle checking his data slate at every junction, counting down the seconds. 70 seconds left, Kyle whispered, his voice tight. They reached a heavy blast door marked with the insignia of the decommissioned freighter docks. A red light glowed above it, indicating it was locked down during the reboot. "The magnetic lock is on an independent circuit," Kyle said, pulling the plasma cutter from his pack. "It won't open." 50 seconds. Kale handed the cutter to Elian. "Cut the primary bolt. There." He pointed to a thick, metallic bar. "I'll work on the bypass." Elian's hands shook as he ignited the cutter, a brilliant blue-white flame hissing to life. He pressed it against the bolt, the metal glowing cherry red, then white. Sparks showered around him, and the smell of burning metal filled the air. Beside him, Kale worked furiously on a control panel, his fingers a blur as he sliced through wires and rerouted circuits. 30 seconds. The bolt gave way with a groan, and Elian deactivated the cutter. At the same moment, Kale slammed his fist against the panel. "Done." The red light above the door flickered to green. They heaved the heavy door open and slipped through, Kyle sealing it behind them. They were in. The decommissioned docks were a cavernous, dark space, a graveyard of old ships. Dust motes danced in the few beams of emergency light that pierced the gloom. It was silent, save for the faint, rhythmic dripping of water somewhere in the darkness. 10 seconds, Kale breathed, his eyes scanning the rows of derelict vessels. "There, Bay 7. He pointed to a small, unassuming courier ship at the far end of the dock, the Stardust Drifter. It was old, its hull scarred and pitted, but to Elian, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was a promise, a way out. They broke into a run, their footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. They were 20 feet from the ramp when the main lights of the dock flared to life, bright and blinding. The 97 seconds were over. The system was back online, and they were exposed. "Commander Kyle," a calm, amplified voice echoed through the hangar. "I must admit, I'm disappointed. I expected a more elegant solution from you." Elian and Kyle froze, spinning around. Standing on a gantry high above them was a tall, severe-looking man in a pristine white uniform. Valerius. He was flanked by a dozen elite Enclave soldiers, their pulse rifles all aimed directly at them. "You didn't really think," Valerius continued, a smug, condescending smile on his face, "that I would leave the Enclave's most valuable asset unguarded during a system reboot, did you? I've been tracking your little power siphons for weeks. It was just a matter of waiting for you to make your move." They were trapped. The escape route was a dead end. The hope that had bloomed in Elian's chest withered into cold, hard despair. Valerius's gaze shifted to Elian, his eyes cold and appraising. "Designation 734. A shame we have to meet under these circumstances, but don't worry. Your great potential will not be wasted. Project Chimera awaits." He then looked back at Kyle. "As for you, Commander, your treason has earned you a particularly unpleasant decommissioning. Surrender now. There is no escape." Kyle didn't answer. He simply pushed Elian behind him, shielding him with his own body. He slowly raised his hands, a gesture of surrender. But Elian saw it. He saw the subtle shift in Kyle's grip on his data slate. He saw the almost imperceptible tensing of his muscles. This was not a surrender. It was a prelude. Kyle was a predator, feigning submission before the final, desperate strike. The cavernous hangar was a tomb of silent, rusting ships, and they were caught in its center, pinned by the cold, bright glare of the overhead lights and the unwavering aim of a dozen pulse rifles. Valerius stood on the gantry above, a figure of absolute triumphant authority. He was the system personified, smug, certain, and utterly without mercy. For a moment, a profound and hopeless despair washed over Elian. This was it, the end of their brief, impossible rebellion. He had tasted a flicker of freedom, of personhood, only to have it extinguished. But then he looked at Kyle. Kyle, who stood in front of him, a human shield. Kyle, whose hands were raised in a mockery of surrender. And in the set of his jaw, in the fierce, defiant fire in his winter sky eyes, Elian saw not despair, but a terrible, cold rage. Kyle was not beaten. He was cornered, and a cornered predator is the most dangerous kind. "A noble gesture, Kyle," Valerius called down, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "Protecting the asset, but it's meaningless. You have failed. Your little emotional outburst has cost you everything." Kyle's voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously calm. "You talk of emotion as if it's a weakness, Valerius. You, who are blinded by ambition and a pathetic desire to live up to my brother's shadow. You've learned nothing." "I learned that sentiment is a liability," Valerius retorted, his smile tightening. "A lesson you're about to learn in the most permanent way. Take them." The soldiers on the gantry began to advance, but Kale was already moving. In one fluid motion, he dropped his hands, slamming his thumb down on his data slate. "Now, Elian," he yelled. Every light in the hangar bay, including the emergency fixtures, instantly died. They were plunged into absolute disorienting darkness. Simultaneously, a deafening, high-frequency screech erupted from the hangar's PA system, a sonic blast that Kyle had pre-programmed. It was a sensory assault designed to cripple and confuse. The soldiers cried out in pain, their night vision optics overloading with static. In the chaos, Kale grabbed Elian's arm, pulling him toward the stardust drifter. "Go, get up the ramp." They ran, guided only by the memory of the ship's location. The air was filled with the sizzle and snap of blind pulse rifle fire as the disoriented soldiers shot at shadows. A bolt of plasma seared the air inches from Elian's head, and he stumbled, his heart seizing in his chest. Kale hauled him to his feet, shoving him forward. "Don't stop." They reached the ramp, the metal cool and solid under their feet. Kale pushed Elian inside. "Get to the cockpit. Power up the primary drive. Now." Elian scrambled through the dark, cramped corridor of the ship, his hands searching for the cockpit door. He found it and stumbled inside, collapsing into the pilot's chair. The cockpit was dark, the controls cold and dead. His hands flew over the console, his mind racing to remember the startup sequence Kyle had drilled into him. He slammed his palm on the ignition panel. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum that vibrated through the entire ship, the systems began to come online. The cockpit screens flickered to life, bathing him in a soft blue glow. Through the forward viewport, he could see Kyle at the bottom of the ramp, his pulse rifle in his hands, laying down, covering fire into the darkness. "Kale!" Elian screamed into the ship's internal comm. "Get in!" Almost there, Kale's voice crackled back, strained. "Seal the outer door on my mark." Outside, the hangar's emergency lights began to flicker back on, Valerius's forces having rebooted the local system. The soldiers, their vision clearing, began to converge on the ship. Kale was hopelessly outnumbered. He was buying Elian time, trading his life for it. The thought was a knife in Elian's gut. He would not leave him. He would not. He looked down at the console, at the ship's external sensor display. It showed the soldiers advancing, their heat signatures glowing red. And then he saw something else. The ship's systems were old, but they were powerful. They included a full-spectrum empathic resonator, a crude, early version of the technology the Enclave had perfected and used on him. It was designed to send out broad psychic pulses, a primitive form of communication. It was Rorik's project made manifest, but this one he could control. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in his mind. He was not a soldier. He was not a pilot. He was a psychic, a weapon. He ripped the synaptic dampener from his temple. The world exploded. The psychic noise of the hangar flooded his senses, the fear and anger of the soldiers, Valerius's cold, triumphant rage, and Kale's fierce, desperate determination, a blazing sun in the chaos. It was agony, a sensory overload that threatened to tear his mind apart, but he pushed through the pain, focusing, gathering his will. He placed his hands on the console, not on the controls, but on the resonator's interface. He closed his eyes and reached out, not with his hands, but with his mind. He didn't just touch the ship's systems, he merged with them. He became the ship. He poured all his pain, all his fear, all his rage, and his desperate love for the man fighting for him, into the resonator. He didn't send a signal. He sent a scream, a silent, psychic scream of pure, raw emotion that blasted through the hangar. Outside, the soldiers stopped. They staggered, clutching their heads, their rifles falling from their hands. They were not trained for this. They were conditioned for physical combat, for tactical warfare. They had no defense against a direct assault on their minds. They collapsed overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions they couldn't process. On the gantry, Valerius let out a strangled cry and crumpled to his knees, his face a mask of agony. Kyle stood, stunned, amidst the fallen soldiers. He looked up at the cockpit of the Stardust Drifter, a look of pure, unadulterated awe on his face. "Now, Kale." Elian's voice, amplified by the ship's external speakers, boomed through the hangar. It was no longer the thin, reedy voice of a victim. It was strong, powerful, resonant, the voice of a commander. Kyle broke from his stupor and sprinted up the ramp. The moment his feet cleared the threshold, Elian slammed his fist on the control to seal the door. The heavy ramp ground shut, sealing them inside their arc. "Hold on," Elian yelled, his hands now flying over the flight controls. He pushed the vertical thrusters to maximum. The old ship groaned in protest, its frame shuddering, but it lifted from the hangar floor. He didn't know how to fly, not really. But the ship knew. And he was the ship. He could feel the flow of energy through its conduits, the response of the engines, the angle of the maneuvering thrusters. He guided it not with technical skill, but with pure, focused intent. He angled the ship toward the main hangar doors, the massive blast shields that led to the void of space. "They're shielded," Kale yelled from behind him, strapping himself into the co-pilot's chair. "We can't break through." "We won't have to," Elian said, his voice grim. He could feel it now, the deep, resonant hum of the hangar's main power conduit running directly beneath the floor. It was a river of pure, raw energy. He closed his eyes again, reaching out with his mind, pushing his psychic resonance to its absolute limit. He found the magnetic containment field of the main conduit and pushed. He pulled. He twisted. The ship shuddered as a massive explosion ripped through the hangar floor behind them. The main power conduit ruptured, unleashing a torrent of raw energy. The blast wave hit them, throwing the ship forward like a stone from a catapult. It slammed directly into the main hangar doors. The reinforced metal buckled, groaned, and then tore apart. And then they were out. They were in the void. Silence. The roar of the explosion, the scream of tearing metal. It all vanished, replaced by the profound, silent emptiness of space. Elian opened his eyes. Before them, the star-dusted infinity stretched out, no longer a picture in a viewport, but a real, tangible place. He could feel the silent song of the cosmos, not as data, but as music. The ship drifted, its engines humming softly. They were battered, but they were free. He slumped back in his chair, the adrenaline leaving him in a rush. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it was a physical pain, washed over him. His head throbbed, and a thin trickle of blood ran from his nose. He had pushed himself far beyond his limits. A hand gently touched his shoulder. He looked over. Kyle was there, his face bruised and grimy, but his eyes were shining with an emotion Elian had never seen before. It was a mixture of awe, relief, and a fierce, overwhelming pride. "Elian," Kyle breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You." He seemed at a loss for words. He simply reached out and gently wiped the blood from Elian's lip with his thumb. Elian managed a weak smile. "You were right," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I am not nothing." Kyle's face softened. He leaned in and pressed a kiss to Elian's forehead, a gesture of pure, unadulterated tenderness. "No," he said, his voice a raw whisper against Elian's skin. "You are everything." He took the controls, his hands moving with a familiar competence as he plotted a course away from the Enclave, toward the unknown territory of the outer sectors. Elian leaned his head against the cool plasteel of the viewport, watching the fortress moonlit that had been his prison shrink until it was just another cold, distant point of light among the stars. They were two fugitives in a stolen ship, running from the only home they had ever known, with no destination and no allies. They were scarred, they were tired, and they were hunted, but they were together, and they were free. The silence of space was a profound and welcome balm after the chaos of their escape. It was not the sterile, manufactured silence of Elian's cell, but a vast, living quietude, filled with the faint, rhythmic hum of the stardust drifter's life support and the distant, silent fire of a billion stars. They flew for hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the Enclave, a wounded beast that would surely hunt them. Kale piloted the ship with a weary expertise, his focus absolute. Elian, drained from his unprecedented use of his abilities, drifted in and out of a shallow, restless sleep in the co-pilot's chair. When he finally woke, it was to the gentle pressure of a blanket being draped over him and the scent of heated, nutrient paste. He opened his eyes to see Kale standing over him, a steaming bulb in his hand. The harsh lines of the commander had softened, replaced by a quiet concern that made Elian's chest ache. "Eat," Kale said softly. "You pushed yourself too far. You need to replenish your energy." Elian sat up, taking the bulb. The warm, bland paste was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. He ate in silence, watching Kale as he returned to the pilot's chair and monitored the navigation console. They were a tiny, insignificant speck in the infinite black, a single point of warmth and life in the cold, indifferent void. "Where are we going?" Elian asked, his voice still hoarse. "Away," Kyle answered simply. He brought up a star chart on the main screen, a dizzying web of star systems and trade routes. There are free colonies in the Attican Traverse, places the Enclave's influence hasn't yet reached. They're rough, lawless, but they are free. We can lose ourselves there. Start over. Start over. The concept was as alien and vast as the starscape outside. Elian had never had a life to begin, let alone start over. His entire existence had been a single, unchanging straight line dictated by others. Now, the future was a blank slate, an uncharted territory filled with terrifying and exhilarating possibility. "Will they follow us?" Elian asked, the fear a cold knot in his stomach. "Valerius will," Kyle said, his voice grim. "He will not let this humiliation stand. He will report that we were killed in the explosion to save face, but he will hunt for us, quietly. He will use the Enclave's resources off the record. We will have to be careful. We will have to become ghosts." Ghosts. It was what Kale had called them before their escape. But then, they were ghosts within the system. Now, they would be ghosts outside of it. Elian looked at his reflection in the dark viewport, at the pale and tired face staring back at him. He was no longer designation 734. He was not yet truly Elian. He was a ghost, a man untethered from his past, floating toward an unknown future. Days bled into weeks. Life aboard the Stardust Drifter settled into a new kind of rhythm. It was a life of close quarters and shared duties. Kale taught Elian the basics of ship maintenance, how to read a navigation chart, how to run a diagnostic on the life support system. Elian, in turn, began to explore the gentler aspects of his psychic abilities. He would reach out with his mind, not to probe or to attack, but simply to feel. He felt the slow, patient life cycle of a distant gas giant, the lonely song of a comet on its long journey through the void. He was, as Kyle's mother had believed, learning to listen to the universe, not just analyze it. In the forced intimacy of the small ship, the emotional walls between them crumbled completely. They talked for hours, filling the silence of space with the stories of their lives. Kyle spoke of his childhood, of the pressure to live up to his family's legacy, of his quiet rebellion in treasuring his mother's forbidden philosophies. Elian spoke of his own past, a disjointed series of memories of sterile rooms, cold instruments, and the constant, crushing weight of being an object. They were laying their scars bare, finding a shared solace in their mutual damage. One cycle, as they passed through a beautiful, shimmering nebula that painted their ship in hues of emerald and gold, Kyle turned to him, his face serious. "There is something I must tell you," he said. "About Rorik." Elian tensed, the memory of that day still a raw wound. "The words he said to you, Omega or not, you're nothing special." Kyle paused, struggling to find the right words. "Those were my words first. I said them to you during your early conditioning sessions. I was trying to reinforce your training, to make you compliant, to make you believe that your only worth was in your utility, so you would not fight against it. It was a cruelty I justified as a necessity." His face was etched with a profound self-loathing. "When Rorik threw those words back at you, my own words, but filled with his contempt, I saw the truth of what I had done, what the Enclave had made me do, what it had made me become. I wasn't just killing him, Elian. I was killing the part of myself that could say those words to you and believe them." The confession hung in the air between them. Elian looked at this man who had been his jailer and was now his savior, and he felt not anger, but a deep, aching empathy. He understood. He understood the cage Kale had been in, the brutal choices he had been forced to make. Elian reached out and took Kale's hand. "You are not that man anymore," he said softly. "Because of you," Kale whispered, his grip tightening on Elian's hand. "You saved me from him. You saved me from myself." They had saved each other. They were two halves of a whole, two souls forged in the same fire, who had found in each other the strength to break free. From that moment on, there were no more secrets, no more guilt. There was only the quiet, steady truth of their bond, a force more powerful than any starship or weapon. After weeks of travel, they finally reached the edge of the Attican Traverse. The stardust drifter, old and battered, limped into the orbit of a small, forgotten moon called Haven. It was a dusty, windswept rock, home to a ramshackle settlement of miners, smugglers, and others who had fallen through the cracks of the galaxy. It was a place of glorious, messy imperfection. They landed the ship in a hidden canyon, far from the main settlement. When they stepped out onto the surface of the moon, Elian took his first breath of unfiltered air. It was thin, and it tasted of dust and strange, alien pollen, but it was real. He felt a light, chaotic wind on his skin for the first time. He looked up and saw a sky that was not a projection or a viewport, but a real sky, with a pale, amber-colored sun, and two small, swift-moving moons. He knelt down and touched the ground, the rough, gritty texture of the red soil a revelation against his fingertips. He was no longer in a cage. He was in the world. Tears streamed down his face, hot and cleansing. Kale stood beside him, a quiet, solid presence. He didn't speak. He simply put his arm around Elian's shoulders, sharing in the profound, overwhelming moment. They had made it. They were free. Their life on Haven was simple, and it was hard. They traded the ship's spare parts for food and supplies, learning to live with less than they had ever known, yet feeling richer than they ever had. They took new names, shedding the last vestiges of their enclave past. Kale became Cass, and Elian became Lian. They were no one, and for the first time, that meant they could be anyone. They found a small, abandoned dwelling carved into the side of the canyon wall and made it their home. It was little more than a cave, but it was theirs. One evening, they sat outside their dwelling, watching the amber sun set, painting the dusty plains in shades of orange and purple. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that only comes from a deep and abiding understanding. "Are you happy?" Cass asked, his voice a low murmur in the twilight. Lian thought for a moment. He was not happy in the simple, uncomplicated way he had read about in the old books on Cass's data slates. He was still haunted by his past. He knew they were still hunted. Their peace was a fragile, precious thing that could be shattered at any moment. But as he looked at the man beside him, at the quiet strength in his eyes, as he felt the real wind on his face and the solid ground beneath his feet, he knew he had something far more valuable than happiness. "I am not an asset," Lian said, his voice quiet but firm. "I am not an experiment. I am not a designation." He turned to Cass, a small, genuine smile gracing his lips for the first time. "I am Lian, and I am home." Cass returned the smile, his own eyes shining with a deep, unwavering love. He reached out, his hand finding Lian's, their fingers lacing together. They sat there, two lost souls who had found each other in the darkness, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. They were ghosts no longer. They were survivors. And as they faced the unknown future, they faced it together, their shared past a scar that bound them, their shared freedom a promise of a new dawn.